I'm not going to use the microphone. Is this loud enough for you? Yes. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for coming. We do really appreciate you here. For those of you who I don't know personally, the voice might be something you heard a lot last year on our alert nows. My name is Liz Brindle. I'm one of the assistant principals. We're really glad that you're here tonight. We, in the past, have made this meeting mandatory for juniors and a separate meeting mandatory for seniors. For those of you who are seniors here tonight, join us for our junior prom meeting. We've done this several different ways, from having DA Timothy Cruz come and speak with parents, and last year had Joni Geltman, a professor at Curry College and a fabulous entertainer, join us. Tonight we're lucky to have Dr. Harris here, who Mr. Ranieri will introduce in a little bit. But just very quickly, I plan on speaking 15 minutes on junior and senior prom. I'll spare you of 5 minutes of information that's pertinent to both junior prom and senior dinner dates. Both of the events are really exciting for both of our classes. Our senior dinner date is this Friday night. For the seniors who are here, it's an event for only seniors. Their tickets were already purchased as of last week. That's an event where we ask parents to drop their students off and pick them up from the Barker Tavern anytime between 6:30 and 7 o'clock. They spend the evening with just their class. Only seniors, class of 2013, are welcome. They enjoy themselves a ton. It's not as formal as a prom, but even though our juniors will enjoy themselves there, and they have a fabulous night. So that's our senior dinner dance. Just like any of our school functions, we do use our same rules. We enforce our alcohol and our substance abuse policies. We do work with the local police if necessary. We've been fortunate in that situation for the past 4 years now that we haven't had any concerns or issues with any students. Really making great choices there that evening. So that's our senior dinner dance, and like I said, that's this Friday night. So all of those pieces that go along with that are some of those same rules we talk about for junior prom. Going a little bit forward into April is our junior prom. If you didn't grab it on the way in, there is a junior prom fact sheet. It's two-sided at the front door. It was part of the attachment. There are not the additional color-coded forms here this evening. Because they're color-coded, we didn't put them as attachments. We didn't want you to have to run staples and buy reams of paper to share with your neighbors. We'll provide those for your students. And because there's only a few opportunities to buy the tickets, we make sure that we give them to all the juniors in their home rooms. We make it really clear to them about what the expectations are. The prom is at Granite Links. It's a great venue. Our students are bused there from this gym. They take a coach bus from here to the links and back. We've changed that. This will be our third year using coach buses. There's no hang-ups about what limo they're going in and what they're going to hide in the limo and what could go on, and then someone is fighting someone the next week, and they all get included in their price of the ticket for $105, a ride to the prom on a bus with 50 other students, and a ride home. We do encourage students to be dropped off here so there's no cars in the parking lot. But again, we help our students to, and that's why we're glad you're here, so we can talk about some of those pieces. Helping our students make really good choices about that evening, what happens before, during, after, so that we don't have a situation where we have to keep your students safe because of something they've chosen to do. The pre-promenade is here in this gym again. The students have chosen not to promenade on the red carpet this year. They want to just be simple and do pictures. It's a community event, and for those of you, anybody in the audience who's attended that before, the pre-promenade event, a few hands, it ends up being a pretty good event for our community. So it's not just limited to, oh, we're all 20 of us are going here, 20 of us are going there. It's the whole community. It's a great time. So we hope that you'll have an opportunity to go as a junior parent, or even as some of our parents who are parents of sixth graders here, which is nice to hear. Those are the basics for both of them. The big pieces are that sometimes our kids forget they need to be in school all day long at both of those events. We do understand that there's doctor's appointments that are planned out weeks ahead of time, but we need to know about those so we can work with the child so when we go down an attendance list, we're not looking at it wondering, uh-oh, so-and-so wasn't here and they are showing up. So we just need information. We can communicate with myself, Mr. Mills, Mr. Wargo about those pieces. The advisors for both of the classes are heavily involved in working with your students, so please don't hesitate to reach out to any of them as well, but we're always willing to work with you. So if you do have any specific questions, I'm more than willing to answer them for you here or right afterwards, or feel free to call me or email me. You're more than welcome to do that over to that. We also have index cards and pens over there if you want to just drop a anonymous or non-anonymous little question for us, let us know. So without any more information from me, I'll introduce to you Mr. Gregory, who's our Director of Health, Wellness, Family, and Consumer Science for the district. And he's going to take care of introducing our speaker tonight. So, Mr.
Hi, everybody. Everybody excited to be on here on Wednesday night? First of all, I just wanted to see some tables set up off the side. I just want to demystify it to you, those a little bit for you. We do have a table for the all-night prom party, so if you're a parent or senior or junior, you want to participate and sign up for a specific duty, it should be welcome to the house, of course.
We're looking for chaperones overnight.
Chaperones overnight. What do you think about that?
Non-student parents.
Excellent. We do have another table set up for our Facts Coalition, which I'm going to kind of allude to in a few minutes. We have a lot of brochures and information. We also have our School Adjustment Council on site, Ms. Jen Lowe as well. We do have a table, this is for senior parents. We do have a table set up with yearbook information as well. There's information, the deadline for parent dedications has passed, but I've been a little lax to extend the deadline through the end of this week for parents who are interested in putting a dedication to their child. We have a lot of dedications already. But with all the snow days, I want to give people a few more days to get dedications in. If you're interested, there's information on that table about dedications and ordering yearbooks as well. And there will be follow-up correspondence about ordering yearbooks early in April as well. The Scituate Facts Coalition, Families, Adolescents, and Communities Together Against Substance, was formed in 2011 to support the Scituate community at large with education, prevention, and intervention efforts pertaining to substances. The need for the coalition's efforts are real considering 2012 school year data reported that students indicated that 38% of them had 5 or more drinks in a row in the past 30 days. 35% of Scituate high school students reported having used marijuana within the past 30 days. Considering this information, it's obvious why the coalition continues to grow in membership and includes parents, students, police, businesses, clergy, school personnel, and really anybody committed to stopping the underage use and overall abuse of substances in this great town. Facts has set up an informational table and resources available to you if you have any questions. We'll also be here after the presentations if you have any questions or want to process some of the information you've heard tonight. Ms. Lopes would be a great resource for that as well. Thank you, Ms. Goddard, Ms. Galvin for being here as well. Any other coalition members in the audience? Thank you. The Scituate Facts Coalition and Scituate Public Schools is grateful to First Baptist Church in Scituate for sharing this informational presentation this evening with the community. Our presenter this evening is Dr. Sion Kim Harris. She's an Associate Professor of Pediatrics at Harvard Medical School and faculty in the divisions of Adolescent, Youth, Adult Medicine, and Developmental Medicine at Boston's Children's Hospital. Dr. Harris is a Senior Research Scientist at the Center for Adolescent Substance Abuse Research at Boston Children's, an internationally renowned research center which strives to be the leading source of innovative, effective strategies in prevention, diagnosis, and treatment of substance-related problems in children and adolescents. Thank you for sharing your time with us this evening. Without further ado, Dr. Harris.
So thank you so much for your patience and for coming out in the middle of the week. I'm sure things are really hectic at home. I know it is for me typically on a Wednesday night. I got stuck in traffic. I thought Scituate was much closer to Boston than it is actually. It's like really, really far, especially during rush hour. So I just want to quickly start with saying a few words about my Center for Adolescent Substance Abuse Research. For us, adolescent substance abuse is not a moral issue, it's not a policy decision. It's really about the health and safety and well-being of our most precious resource, which is our young people. So it's really about life or death. And I know that I've heard in Scituate that you know all too well what that is with the deaths that we've experienced this time. So just to show the faces of some of the young people that we have had the honor of knowing, and unfortunately their lives were lost and cut too short because of substance use issues. And really, this is what drives our work. It's really to keep our young kids safe. So what are the leading causes of death for adolescents in the U.S.? And as you can see here, really 1 out of 2 deaths of young people are due to unintentional injuries. And then we have homicides and suicides as the trifecta of the leading causes of death for young people. Among unintentional injuries, we have really the majority being motor vehicle crashes. And then followed by poison. And I think we all know the role that substance use plays in both of those, a significant role in both of those causes of death, of unintentional deaths. So what I'm going to do very quickly tonight is review what is going on in adolescent brain development, and then how substance use, what we're learning in science today about how substance use seems to be impacting the brain during adolescence. So I think you all recognize as parents, I think most of you are, these beautiful young faces, these sort of heavenly preteens. So somehow they go from this to this. And a lot of parents are kind of left wondering what happened, right? So we're starting to understand through the neuroscience what exactly is going on that creates this big shift in transition. So what is going on in the teen brain? So until recently, and really this is quite a sea change, a paradigm shift in the last 20 years, until about 20 years ago we thought that brain development was done by the age of 10 to 12. That really pretty much, the brain was growing up until then, and then things were pretty static after that. But I think we all could figure out, though, that that's not true. Those of us who, have gone through adolescence and those who know adolescence. What we now know, however, is we have the hard science to know that adolescence is actually a critical period in brain development, and that the brain is still developing until the mid-20s. So there's been a lot of publicity around this. So what I'm going to do is talk about what exactly does that mean. So what is a critical period in brain development? So to illustrate what that means, I'm going to talk about the research of these 2 gentlemen that was conducted back in the 60s. So these are Drs. Hubel and Wiesel. They were Harvard scientists who are very happy here in this picture because they just won the Nobel Prize in Physiology of Medicine for their work. So what was going on at the time that they were doing this research was there was this medical conundrum that nobody quite knew what to do with. So kids can be born with cataracts. I think there are, cataracts are a fairly common thing, certainly as we get older. But sometimes kids are born with cataracts. Now, the surgeons would wait until they were at least a year old before they would do surgery to correct those cataracts, because surgery itself carries risk. So they would wait until after a year old to do that surgery. However, when they did the surgery, the sight in that eye was not restored. And they couldn't figure out why. The lens of the eye was perfectly clear, but there was not sight to that eye. Well, so back to Drs. Hubel and Wiesel. So they used these cute little critters to do their research. So they took kittens of different ages and they sewed the eyelid shut, one eyelid shut. It didn't harm the eyeball, they just sewed the lid shut. And then after a period of time, they would unsew the eye. They would sew the eye, they would open the eye again. And what they would find is that depending on when they sew the eyelid shut, the sight would not be restored to the kitten. And what they found was that in looking at the brain and what seemed to activate when they had, opened the eye again, what they found was that that part of the brain was no longer controlling sight for that eye. So now, what they also did was they took adult cats and they did the same thing. They sewed the eyelid shut, but what they found was when they opened the eye in the adult cat, the adult cat got their sight back, no problem. And I think, we all know many people that might have had cataract surgery. When, as adults, you get cataract surgery, you're able to get your eyesight back, no problem, with the clearing of that lens. So, something about that period of time during the kitten's brain developmental years that taking, the sight away from that eye caused permanent loss of sight. So what we now understand is a critical period in brain development. Is essentially, it's a window in brain development when a part of the brain is developing rapidly, but is highly sensitive to environmental exposures and experiences. So the brain develops in response to the input and the experiences that it's getting, and it's molding itself accordingly. So for humans, the critical period for the sight for visual cortex development is, I think, somewhere between 4 to 6 weeks or something like that. And so if you wait until a year, you've kind of lost the ability to really have the brain rebound from that loss of the input. Okay, so now, given that, we now know that the brain continues to develop all the way into the mid-20s, let's talk about what that means. So until about ages 10 to 12, the brain undergoes rapid growth, and what that means is that the number of brain cells, neurons, increases. So kids' brains are actively growing in size and weight. Also, the neurons are growing these kind of branches, and those branches connect to other neurons, so we call that blossoming. So during that period of time, they're increasing the number of neurons and increasing the number of branching that each neuron has to other neurons, so getting more connections. So this is what a neuron looks like under the electron microscope. And after this proliferation, it might look like this. Now, after this period, though, the brain starts to undergo pruning. So, pruning as in, you're pruning away sort of the dead branches or branches that you don't want. The brain goes through that same process using the principle of use it or lose it. So the connections that are being used get strengthened and kept, whereas during this pruning process, the connections that are not being used get pruned away. Now, why would the brain do that? So I'll talk about that in a minute. So here, just to illustrate, so at birth, so there aren't as many neurons or connections. And then at 6, you see this, little dense forest. But then at 14, you're starting to see kind of a pruning away of that density. At the same time that this is going on, myelin sheets are starting to encase the nerve cells, the connections between these neurons. So there's the cell body of the neuron, and then there are the long spindly fibers that reach out to the other neurons. And this myelin sheathing starts to happen. So myelin is a fatty white tissue that acts like insulation on an electrical wire. It's exactly that. It's insulation. And the point of the myelin is to have the electrical signals going across the neurons, have them go faster and more efficiently, just like you would have insulation on an electrical wire. So, I found this amazing picture to show the comparison that what we call those myelinated axons, or the parts of the neurons that are myelinated, we call them white matter tracts. And this is a human brain where just the white matter tracks are being shown. The rest of the brain has been kind of stripped away so you can see. So these are long, long fibers. Some can be almost a meter long that connect different parts of the brain together so that the communication can happen. So here, from the back of the brain to the front and the two hemispheres of the brain, these are what we would call the brain's information superhighway, because these are the highways on which the brain's signals travel, just like the highway that we are traveling in our cars. So what happens is during this period of development, so this is a conglomeration of brain scans from kids of different ages, so from age 5 to age 20. What you're seeing here is a gradual transformation of gray matter, which is the bare neurons that have not been myelinated yet, all the way, so transformation to white matter. This is the myelinated neurons. And so the more pink, the greater gray matter, the more blue, the greater white matter. So as you can see, there's a gradual progression of the brain to go from more gray matter to more white matter. And so up here, even at the age of 20, you can see there's still areas of the brain that has yet to fully get myelinated. So the result is when all of this has happened, the pruning and the myelination, when all of that is complete, is that we end up with faster but fewer connections to the brain. Why would that be? Well, essentially, it's our brain trying to become as efficient as possible. So I like to use the analogy of the highway system. So when I need to go from point A to point B, I usually try to find the fastest way to get there. So if there's a highway as opposed to local roads, I would choose the highway. So the brain is trying to prune away those local roads that aren't being used and that kind of get in the way of the transmission of the signal, and really turning the brain into these really efficient superhighways. Okay, so this is data from brain imaging studies looking at adult brains and adolescent brains. And here they color and show by these blobs the areas of the brain that seem to go through the most change during adolescence, that have to really develop during that adolescent period. So I'm going to first focus on this part of the brain. So this is the front part, the prefrontal cortex right behind our foreheads. And that part of the brain, which many of you may have heard about already, we call the prefrontal cortex, and that part of the brain is critical for what we call executive functions. It's really the higher function part of the brain. We call it our CEO of the brain. It's involved in helping us with impulse control, decision making, organizing and planning, abstract thought, rational thinking, attention and focus, working memory. These are all really important for us to be able to be organized, to get things done in our lives, to make good decisions. So the prefrontal cortex is really critical for those functions. So just as an illustration to give you a sense of what it's like to be part of a scientific study that looks at sort of the different brain functions, I'm going to ask you to participate in a little neuropsych test. And it's called the go, no-go task. Okay, are you up for it? It's very, very quick and easy. Okay, so these arrows, when you see these arrows going to the left or the right, that means raise your hand. Okay, that's the go signal. But when you see this up-facing arrow, that means don't go. That means don't raise your hand. Okay? So, here we go. Great. We call that the oddball. It kind of triggers a different part of the brain. Great. So typically this would go on for like at least 3 minutes. Okay. okay? And what a research group did was they put people in the scanner, adults and adolescents, and they had them do this on a computer screen while the research participants were in the scanner. And then they looked at the parts of the brain involved and whether they activated. That means, whether they kind of had more blood flow going to that part of the brain. So what they found was that adults showed more activation of the prefrontal cortex in the no-go condition. That means where the response had to be inhibited. The adults showed more activation there than adults. Interestingly, teens were faster in responding though. They could, get to that button much more quickly. I'm sure there's part of the whole Xbox generation might have something to do. So they were faster in responding, but the adults were ultimately more accurate in withholding the response when they needed to. And the withholding actually takes a lot more energy than the go. So having to withhold means having to exert more energy. So now the other part of the brain that's also rapidly developing during adolescence is this part of the brain, which we call it's sort of deep in the middle of the brain. We call it the limbic area of the brain. We also call it the reptilian brain because evolutionarily that's the oldest part of our brain, whereas the prefrontal cortex is one of the newest parts. We share this part of the brain with other animal species, so it's very ancient. So in this part of the brain, I'm going to talk about two structures, the amygdala and the hippocampus. Okay, so what do they do? The amygdala and the hippocampus are both really important in the formation and storage of memories. The amygdala in particular, it deals with emotional memories. Memories that carry with them a lot of charge, a lot of emotional charge, fear, pleasure, and that those get sort of embedded by the amygdala. The amygdala is also involved in the stress response. That's what gets triggered when we're in our fight-flight mode. And of course that evolved to help us avoid this kind of predator when we were evolving our brains, to remember that we don't want to go anywhere near this sort of thing. So now the amygdala is hyper-reactive in anxiety disorders, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and aggression. And it's developing rapidly in adolescence. So adolescents have this kind of going full tilt, which might explain why you might have a bit more emotionality in adolescence, more moodiness, okay? Now, to be fair, adolescents are not the only ones to overreact. So, you can see, so here's the daughter and her boyfriend, she's introducing to her father, and she's saying, Spike, meet my dad, he overreacts. And he's on the floor going, anyway. Okay, so another part of the brain that's in this limbic system is the reward pathway. So you may have heard about this. These structures, the ventral tegmental area of the nucleus accumbens and the prefrontal cortex are involved in helping us learn what makes us feel good and want to do it over and over again. So this part of the brain lights up, essentially, when we eat good food, when we fall in love, when we have sex, procreation, when we have a good time with our friends, social cooperation. So these were all behaviors that helped us as a species survive. And those are things that really get rewarded by the reward pathway. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about how the reward pathway actually responds differently between adults and adolescents. So again, this is from, as I said before, an MRI study where they put people in the scanner and then they ask people to do some kind of a task and then they look at the way that the brain activates. So in this study, they put people of different age groups, children, adolescents, and adults, and they put them in the MRI scanner and then asked them to play a money game where there were actual rewards, monetary rewards for the game. And they would show, after the little task was done, they would show the participants different levels of rewards, small, medium, and large. And then they would see how their reward pathway would activate. So here's what they found in response to a small reward, maybe a couple of dollars. So the children, so this is the amount of activation of that reward pathway over time, as they were playing the game and finding out what reward they got. So children in blue, when they found out their small reward, they were very happy. Woo! I got a reward, all right. It's a small reward, but hey, it's a reward. Now adults in green were essentially flatlined. It's $2, what's the big deal, right? Now, with adolescents, they find out it's a small reward, and their reward pathway, their reward circuit actually deactivates, as if they're saying, that was lame, okay? It's like they're rolling their eyes, okay? Come on, give me a break. Okay, now, in response, however, to a large reward, here's what happened. So children, same kind of thing, their reward circuit activates pretty similarly to the small reward, okay? This is why, with my kids, I could, when they were young, I could use a sticker chart to reward good behavior, and I can't do that now, because they're teenagers. So children, still activating the same way. Adults, now their reward pathway is activating more. Now we're talking, real bucks here. With adolescents, their reward pathway goes way up, even more strongly than adults. So the implication is that adolescent brains seem to have a greater response, a stronger response to highly stimulating activities. Much more, and that in some ways it's really hard for them to feel much, much excitement really about things like cleaning up the room or studying hard for that, distant in the future 8th grade that they might get, at the end of the semester. So those, not very stimulating activities aren't going to be as rewarding as the, really stimulating things. So that might be why you see, adolescents going after these kinds of activities, or at least some of them, not all, or these kinds of activities, highly stimulating activities. Now, every single substance of abuse highly stimulates the reward pathway in the brain. Okay? So that could implicate, why, that could imply, that could be one of the reasons or explanations for why adolescents seem to be really at greater risk for trying and abusing substances. Now, unfortunately, the way the brain develops puts teens at risk. So the brain tends to develop from the back to the front, and I think you might have noticed that with that the slide that showed the brains, across different ages. So it tends to start in the back and finish development in the front, which means that the parts of the brain here in the middle are gearing up much more quickly than the prefrontal cortex here. So the way that I put it is that the gas pedal, or the reward system, is hypersensitive in adolescence, while the braking system, the prefrontal cortex, is still not fully connected up with the rest of the brain to be able to apply that inhibitory control and good judgment. It's just harder for adolescents. So really for me, when I learned about this as a parent, I realized I have to be my children's prefrontal cortex until theirs is online. Until theirs comes fully online. So the key points, connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the rest of the brain is improving throughout adolescence, and it's not complete until the mid-20s. And so this could explain why teens tend to have a more hot brain, more emotional, more impulsive, and less cool compared to adults. Okay, so how do drugs affect the developing brain? So this was really surprising to me. It turns out that teen brains are affected by drugs differently than adult brains. And this work really draws on animal research because, ethically, can be giving drugs to our adolescents. So let's look at the evidence regarding alcohol. So adolescent rats were found to be less sensitive to the sedative and motor impairment effects of alcohol compared to adult rats. Okay? So what exactly does that mean and how did they figure that out? So in this study, so it was actually a colleague of mine who conducted this work. They took different aged rats. This is the age of the rat. And they gave them different amounts of alcohol. And they looked to see how long it took. So alcohol is sedating for rats, okay? And they looked to see how long it took a rat to flip over. So rats don't like to be on their backs. So if they're on their backs, it means that they really can't move. They're pretty out cold. Okay? But they're gonna want to flip over as soon as they can, as soon as they're able to. So this is the amount of time it took for the rat to flip over. And so the younger the rats, the faster they flipped over, regardless of the amount of alcohol that they were getting. So they were less sedated than adults. Now another study looked at motor performance. Okay, so here is something called the water-based test, and it's a pool of water, and there is hidden in that pool of water a platform. It's submerged below the surface. And what they did was they took rats and they dropped them into the pool of water, and the rat hates swimming. So the rat tries to find that platform so that they can stop swimming. So it takes a little bit of time for the rat to kind of swim here, swim there, and figure out where this platform is, okay? Well, it turned out that alcohol did not slow down adolescent rats in terms of their swim speed, but it did slow down adult rats. However, both adolescent and adult rats who were given alcohol compared to saline, which was the control condition, took longer. So those alcohol given rats, they took longer to find that hidden platform. So even though they were swimming around faster, those adolescent rats took longer. Now, what is going on here? So in order to find that platform, you actually have to learn as you go, okay? Otherwise, it'll take you a while. So if you go look for the platform over here, and then you go over there, you don't want to go back to the same place that you didn't find it the first time, right? So you have to be learning as you go. So that learning capacity was impaired in both adolescents and adults who get given alcohol. So the implication is that adults, now these are not necessarily adults who started drinking when they were adolescents and continue to drink. When adults, who are relatively inexperienced with alcohol, if they're given a fair amount of alcohol, they might fall asleep. With adolescents, they're going to be up and around, okay? Even though their cognition is impaired. So this is potentially why we have so many of these tragic stories of adolescents getting into cars with somebody who might be using, who thinks that they're fine because they're walking, talking, as they think that they should be. So now the problem is that when adolescents drink and they aren't as sensitive to the kind of the protective effects of alcohol, that is the falling asleep and not really being out there in the world, potentially getting injured. The problem is that if you can drink more, you probably will drink more, okay? Which has been shown to lead to greater risk for developing abuse or dependence with a substance. Now this data here is from a national survey that looked at the percent of people who developed an alcoholism, developed an alcohol disorder, based on when they started to drink. So here, 13 to 14-year-olds, about half of them eventually developed an alcohol disorder. If they waited, if we wait till we're 21 or older, it's only about 9%. So there's a 5-fold difference in the risk for developing a problem with alcohol depending on when you start. And that also could be partly because the brain is still developing during these ages, and your brain and their brains are rapidly changing in response to that input over the critical period. We could really show you, I can show you graphs that look like this for just about every drug. So this is also marijuana. So here they're starting early, and the risk for developing a marijuana dependence problem is 4 times greater than if they started at 21 or older. Okay? So something about the teen brain is so much more vulnerable to developing problems. The other major concern that we're finding out through these studies is that there seems to be problems with memory and cognition over time from alcohol and drug use. So back to this area of the limbic system. So remember the hippocampus, it's involved in memory formation. So this part of the brain, I call it the key to the SATs. It's involved in really facts and figures. You know, it's critical for creating memory that keeps track of who, what, where, when, those kinds of things. So it's really important for schooling that this is a healthy part of the brain. Well, so some scientists looked at something called spatial working memory. So what they did was they put people in the scanner, adolescents, and they first asked them to just keep track of this little squiggly line on the screen and just watch it. And then what they did was they asked adolescents to watch where the squiggly line starts on the screen and then watch it move around, and when that squiggly line goes back to where it started, to click the button. So you have to hold in your mind where it started off on the screen, the spatial spot for it, and then perform the task. So here's what they found with comparing 16-year-olds, one who was a non-drinker and one who had been drinking for about 2 years, been drinking fairly regularly. Okay, so the more yellow and orange, the more activating the parts of the brain are. So here, the heavy drinker actually had greater activation in the part of the brains that were involved in this task. So why greater activation than the non-drinker? Well, their performance on the task was the same, so there was no difference in the memory performance, but it looks like the heavy drinkers had to work harder. Their brains had to work harder to do the same task. Now, they also looked at older teens or young adults. Now, these are 20-year-olds. Now, the heavy drinking 20-year-olds had been drinking for many more years, so they had been drinking for 5 years as opposed to just 2 years. Now look at what's going on. In response to this task, now there's not even good activation happening in the 20-year-old brain after that many years of drinking. So, what we're finding is that the hippocampus is sensitive to the effects of alcohol and drugs, and that alcohol and drugs interfere with learning and memory and the effect on brain development. What we're not sure is how permanent is this effect. Fortunately, the hippocampus is one of the few areas of the brain that continues to generate new brain cells throughout life. So it's possible that there is, if the substance use is stopped, that part of the brain could regenerate. But in the scanner, what the same group found was when they looked at the size of the hippocampus, comparing those teens who had been drinking heavily and those who had not, you could see that this, the hippocampus is bigger among the non-drinkers. And actually, it was 10 to 35% smaller among the non-drinkers. So there's actually, really what's happening is they're losing brain cells in that part of the brain. Okay, so the brain and marijuana. So very quickly, the main psychoactive chemical in marijuana is delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC for short, which we probably have all heard of. So the reason THC works in our brain is that it binds to receptor sites on our neurons. And these little pink dots show where there are a lot of these, what we call cannabinoid receptor sites in the brain that THC binds to. So why in heaven's name would we have receptor sites for THC in our brain? I mean, were we meant to smoke marijuana or something? So it turns out that THC looks an awful lot like a chemical that our own brain makes called anandamide. And there are actually a few different chemicals that our own brain makes that bind to these receptors. We call them endocannabinoids, something that our own brain has. So these endocannabinoids and the receptors that they bind to create what we call the brain's endocannabinoid system. And what does it do? What we are finding now, and this is pretty new information, is that the endocannabinoid system is really, really important for keeping an even keel of neuron activity in the brain. And it's kind of like a volume control dial. So when neurons start to get too excited, too much activity, they're firing too much, this system detects that and helps to dampen it down. So it helps to protect the brain from kind of burning out, essentially, brain cells from burning out. So it really is important for regulating the levels of all these important chemicals in our brain that affect pleasure, mood, pain, appetite, motivation, memory, including dopamine, serotonin, endorphins. You might have heard of some of these things. The high that we get from endorphins, antidepressant medication targeting serotonin, etc. So it turns out that this endocannabinoid system is really widely present in the brain and really important for its healthy functioning. And that it helps keep neuron activity in balance, not underactive, like say in depression or in ADHD. Actually, one of the reasons that kids with ADHD have a hard time inhibiting impulses, that the parts of the brain that need to really ramp up to pay attention are underactive. And also that it helps to protect neurons from being overactive and basically burning out. So the other crazy thing that we're finding out with the endocannabinoid system is that it actually is really important for brain development. It helps to guide, so this system is already present in the brain of the fetus. So we have this in our brains even before we're born. And it really is involved in brain development through the life course. It is involved in guiding neurons to grow to the right places in the brain, eventually for correct functioning. And to control neuron activity, it actually, because neurons that fire together wire together, because it's involved in modulating neuron activity, it actually impacts the way the brain wires up, that connectivity. And it's involved in myelination. So remember, an efficiently working brain really needs that myelin to protect the electrical signal. So what we found about THC is that THC works like, it hits those same receptors as anandamide, but rather than kind of, individually targeting cells in a very scalpel-like manner, THC is like a sledgehammer, okay? It suppresses activity of the neuron in a much longer and stronger way. And in the hippocampus, in order for memories to form, the hippocampus neurons have to get excited enough to actually form the memory. But THC suppresses the activity of the hippocampus below the level needed to trigger memory formation. So one of the classic symptoms of marijuana use is short-term memory loss. And that's because it suppresses the activity of the hippocampus. Now, with chronic THC exposure, what we're finding is that neuron connections needed to store memory are gradually lost. Remember that use it or lose it? So those brain cells are continually being suppressed. You lose them over time. Now, this study is really an important study because it was one of the first to show, and it came out recently, to follow people from the age of really birth all the way to the age of 38. And what it did was, at the age of 13, before kids started using marijuana, they did a whole neuropsych testing to get at IQ and memory and vocabulary, etc. So they tested everybody before they started using marijuana. And then they also measured their substance use at 18, 21, 32, and 38, and then also tested IQ and did the whole neuropsych testing again at the age of 38. And as you can imagine, some people started to use marijuana and some didn't. What they found in terms of the IQ score, this graph must have gotten a little messed up. So the average IQ of those who had never used marijuana, it's on the left side, was 99.8 at the age of 13. Those who had started using at some point between 13 and 38, their average IQ was 99.7. So essentially they were the same at the age 13. Their IQs were the same. Now, at the age of 38, what they did was they found here, those who had never used marijuana, the average IQ for those who had never used was 100.6. So there was really no change in their IQs between 13 and 38 for those who had never used marijuana. Those who had used marijuana at least 3 or more years, heavily, their IQs on average declined 7 points by the time they were 38. Now, interestingly, they looked at those who had stopped using by the age of 38. And what they found was that those who had started before the age of 18, started weekly use before the age of 18, they had this big decline in their IQ scores. But those who had not started before the age of 18, they had started using marijuana after 18, but had stopped by age 38, there was no difference. So there was something about, so everybody here had used marijuana at some point in their lives. These folks had started before they were 18. And that is lasting change in their life. And then finally, just to show, marijuana has been found to be linked with risk for mental illness. These reports came out recently, summarizing the research around that. So regular marijuana use during adolescence found increased risk 2 to 5 times of developing psychosis, schizophrenia, anxiety, and depression in adulthood, particularly for kids who come from families where there's a genetic risk. If you have a genetic risk, there seems to be an earlier age of developing schizophrenia. And there's also the heightened risk for developing depression and anxiety in adulthood. So, why would that be there? Why would there be that increased risk? Well, we don't exactly know yet, but it seems like some studies that have looked at white matter is showing that there might be some issues with white matter development. So here, they looked at white matter right in this area of the brain. This is a non-user of marijuana. These are daily users. And as you can see, there's like a thinness here compared to here in the white matter tracks. Also, another study found that there were issues with the integrity of the white matter right here that were found to be common both in schizophrenics and teen marijuana users. And this part is white matter connecting the prefrontal cortex with this, the limbic system. So the ability to manage signals between those two areas of the brain. So that could be what is underlying some of that risk. Now, one of the trends that we're seeing is that the THC content in marijuana has greatly changed in the last 20 years. Really, it's doubled, at least doubled in the last 20 years, and in some cases, this is just an average. So the more THC, the more potential for those kinds of adverse effects of the THC in the brain. So in summary, The teen years are a time of tremendous opportunity and risk for the brain. And that unfinished brain development makes teens more vulnerable to risk-taking, addiction, and long-term changes from alcohol and drug use. Now, to end on a more positive note, things that help promote healthy brain development during childhood and adolescence: exercise. Exercise has been shown to grow new brain cells, to improve mood, and really, for adolescents, this is really key to healthy brain development. And good sleep hygiene, getting enough sleep. So what we're finding is that sleep is actually critical for learning and memory formation. People who get enough sleep have less obesity and hypertension, and it improves mood and prefrontal cortex function. So for parents, this is a great guide that's available at this website called 7 Ways to Protect Your Teen from Alcohol and Other Drugs, and that could be a good resource for learning ways to communicate with your teen about this. Okay. So thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions. Did everyone hear that question that was asked? No? No? Okay. It was, does having used and then stopped, does that cause, permanent damage, or is there the possibility of regenerating, parts of the brain that were damaged? And I was saying, the science is still growing around that, but we are seeing that the hippocampus in particular can grow new brain cells. Really, there's the possibility of growing new brain cells even, well into the 80s in that part of the brain. So, so there is likely regeneration, but it takes time. It takes a while before that happens, with abstinence. Any other questions? Yes?
All of this is being a parent. All of these things as a parent are 40, 50, 60 years old. How do you get a 50-year-old, a 20-year-old, or a 12-year-old to grasp? I think it's all the details is critique, but the summary is helpful. For me.
Yeah. Well, so the question is, the information that was presented is, pretty compelling to parents, 40, 50-year-olds. But how do 15-year-olds react to this, and how can you help, 15-year-olds kind of take this information, right? Is that, yeah. So, being a parent myself of a 15-year-old, I can kind of speak from personal experience. To the extent that we can give them the knowledge, the knowledge is important, that, what we know now is that your brain is still developing and maturing, and you really want to, do what you need to do to keep it, developing in a healthy way. However, what I also showed you is that in the heat of the moment, It's harder for adolescents to make good choices because, you know, sometimes it's more the drive for the pleasure or the excitement that takes over the prefrontal cortex. So both things are true, that they can respond to the information. And actually, something that we've done in Lexington, where I live, and I've worked with some other school districts, was to work with the science teachers to incorporate a neuroscience unit into the biology curriculum. So they learn about the brain, you know, how it works, and how different substances affect the brain, and how addiction happens in the brain. So that is really important so that they know, but knowledge isn't necessarily enough, as I said, in the heat of the moment. So this is where parents really have to, you know, provide the monitoring and the boundaries and the, you know, negotiating the rules, so that we kind of provide the prefrontal cortex function for them. So, yes. So the question was, we should have thought about this before we voted to approve medical marijuana in Massachusetts, because now the implication is marijuana is going to be so much more accessible, just in general. And we have been keeping an eye on the experience in California and Colorado, and you know, we see what's going on in those states, and it's really concerning. I think, again, though, it's really about parents and adults, you know, really providing safeguards, you know, that we're aware of who our kids are hanging out with, where they are at all times, trying to limit, you know, their sort of being out and about, you know, without supervision, that sort of thing. So I think that in Vermont, where they also have legalized medical marijuana, they don't have very many, they don't have, you know, a huge dispensary system, they don't have very many medical marijuana card holders, unlike in Colorado, where like 4% of the state has a medical marijuana card. So it really varies from state to state. So I think the jury is out in how Massachusetts is going to handle this. And you know, the argument about why not legalize marijuana when alcohol and tobacco are both legal, and they're both, you know, if anything, you know, even more harmful in terms of lives lost and everything compared to marijuana. That's, you know, that's an argument. So, you know, we have to provide safeguards for our kids. Any other questions?
You have a takeaway for your oven already. So there's your party. You have